Hello everyone, it is Joe here from OmniPoke, the channel that brings you guys everything Pokemon. If you're looking for PTCG live codes, make sure you check out the Potown store. You can get a 5% discount on your orders using that code OmniPoke. For today's video, myself and Jack are going to be going over our Temporal Forces / EUIC tier list. We've had the cards out in PTG Live for a week or so now. We've been playing this in person and chatting about the formats for a few months, to be honest with you. It's been taking up a lot of our attention for a while, so hopefully we have a decent grasp on the metagame, and we're going to be discussing what the sort of best positioned decks are, as well as just how generally strong these archetypes are, looking towards the EUIC. So Jack, do you want to get into it?
Yeah, we'll kick off with some lower tier archetypes just to sort of get them off the list early on. Going to start off with Ancient Box, one of the new archetypes that sort of came out just pretty much, it was entirely spawned from Temporal Forces. Basically, there's with a lot of these D tier decks, there's just not really compelling data behind being able to justify playing them. There's typically decks that have just plain better matchup spreads that do very similar things, and that's kind of the case with Ancient Box. It doesn't actually have particularly impressive matchup spread that struggles with some of the A-tier decks, which we'll get into momentarily. It's it's this cool one prize archetype, but ultimately it doesn't actually, like, it's still pretty convoluted getting to some of the later stages. There's still issues with being able to get to sort of high tier damage and stuff like that to deal with Charizard and things like that. So yeah, it's a really cool archetype. It's I think one of the cooler archetypes that came out of the set, to be honest. But unfortunately, even things like Straight Moon just adopting some baby Roaring Moon seem to just be a little bit more consistent, a little bit better at doing what the deck's trying to do. So yeah, unfortunately kicking off in the D tier for Ancient Box, which is a shame, but it's just kind of fallen by the wayside.
Yep, similar thing for Goldengo. We're going to put this in the D tier. Seems like the basic core concept of the deck can just be done better as chien-pao, and Goldengo's win rates across the board has been pretty low against almost everything, ironically, apart from chien-pao. But yeah, it looks like if you want to be playing this one-hit KO option, you're better off playing the water-based build rather than Goldengo right now.
Another archetype that kind of has a better counterpart is Great Tusk Mill, which we're going to pop in the D tier as well. Again, the data behind it just shows that Snorlax and even Pidgeot Snorlax are just strictly better controlling style options. This obviously is a little bit of a different take. It's a more of a milling archetype, and obviously that is a bit different. And equally, people are like, the talk of the town at the moment is Snorlax and how popular it's going to be and stuff like that. It seems that there's a lot of people really rating Snorlax. Kind of gets caught in the crossfire because it's doing a little bit of a different thing. It may get away with it here and there slightly differently, and it may be a little bit more successful here and there. But realistically, these controlling archetypes, even still, are just outperforming it basically data-wise. I do think it's, again, another fun one to try out, and it seems to be quite popular on the ladder, at least from sort of what I've been gathering here and there. And the few games that I've played so far, it seems like sort of like a fan favorite deck. But again, similarly, there's just better ways of doing this sort of controlling thing right now.
Another D tier one is the Dialga Metang deck. Obviously, you're playing a huge chunk of energy cards in your deck. You're not all that consistent. You don't have many cards dedicated towards draw, and your overall matchups into the top tier stuff, the Lugia, the chien-pao, pretty bad, and you don't even have like that good of a Zard, so there's actually just no selling point to the archetype, and you're playing one of the lesser consistency decks in the game. So yeah, there's no real draw towards playing Dialga, which means it's probably not worth taking to a big tournament like this one.
And finally, we're looking at sort of a future box sort of type coverage style deck. Obviously, Future Hands is a deck that I think has impressed a lot of people, and we are going to be talking about that a little bit later on. The biggest difference between sort of the Future Box deck, I think typically people probably thought this was going to be quite good because you can just pick and choose what matchups you want to try and beat, and that is probably one of the most compelling reasons to play the deck, is that you can kind of, if you can get a really good read on the meta, you could have a deck that just basically farms some really favorable matchups. I think the biggest thing that's been found with Future Hands is that the deck is full of brilliant cards, but one of the key cards is Gift Energy, and all the different flavors of energy you have to play in the Future Box deck means that you really start to eat into those spaces, and sometimes you can't even play Gift Energy at all, meaning that, you know, you just have to really rely on pretty much no draw engine and just your supporters and stuff like that. And it's just trying to piece together these tight-knit combos and specific like Pokemon for specific matchups is just really hard without having some supplementary draw power. So yeah, kind of focusing in on the Iron Hands and Iron Crown and just Gift Energies and Batons and trying to really be this oppressive sort of like bully deck turns out is a little bit better than trying to be a type coverage box. So yeah, like I think there's still room to be explored with some of the future decks, and I still feel like I'm seeing plenty of different ways of playing the, like, even the Future Hands deck. here and there. But this type coverage style box where you can play all sorts of different future Pokemon, I don't think is really anything more special than just trying to bully people with Ampy very much, to be honest.
Yeah, with some of the lower tier stuff out of the way, let's jump up to what we're expecting to be the most popular and highest tier decks. And I think Charizard definitely fits that category. It's expected to be the most popular deck in the day one field. It's done really well in city leagues in Japan, far and away the best performing archetype over there for the last few months, and it still obviously was one of the top contenders from the previous format for us. So the expectation is that Charizard's going to remain very, very strong, and I do think that is going to continue to be the case. You still have great combat potential at your disposal. You have a great way to force single prizes into the mix, be it Radzard or be it Charmander poking stuff as well, and sort of maintaining some single prize boards. You can have that great tank ability, which is still relevant in a number of situations. You are a little bit less tanky than the previous format because there is Iron Leaves being teched into a few decks, like the Arctina and Lost Zone Tina have a slightly better time into you than in the past. And because Charizard is expected to be this like most popular deck in the room, there is that target on its back, which means for the EUIC it may not actually be the best positioned archetype. It's a bit of a weird one. So, sort of your best matchups are like Future Hands and Lost Box, which are certainly relevant decks in the metagame, but there's going to be a lot of decks by the looks of things in this format, so a lot of your matchups are going to be long slogs in best of 350 minutes, which kind of puts me personally off Charizard a little bit. I still think it's going to be a pretty good performer and certainly very consistent, but it does feel like the meta is kind of warping around Charizard as public enemy number one, and I don't know how well Charizard can sort of stand up to that pressure. We still think it's an A-tier deck, and it certainly has some relevant matchups in the format and is still pretty consistent, but I'm finding it hard to put my finger on Charizard because there are some pretty high-profile bad matchups like Snorlax, which we'll get onto in a moment, which is making me a little bit nervous for the archetype.
Onto chien-pao, another A-tier archetype that we think is going to be pretty popular at EUIC. This is another archetype that I think people were really impressed with, sort of just coming off of the back of the City League results. I think it had a little bit of a dip sort of after the first couple of weeks, but it's still seeing a huge amount of play in some of the early tournaments and boasts a pretty impressive win rate. Chien-pao, I think, is the deck, or one of the decks, that actually almost benefits from the rotation. It doesn't really get hurt by a lot of things that it loses. It gains Buddy Buddy Poffin, which obviously other decks do as well, but it's like it already has this Irida engine, meaning that it's basically VIP Pass, but better because Irida searches out for everything else that you can't find with that. Plus, you've also still got the backup Irida engine of finding like Baxcalibur and Rare Candy as well. So it's like it has VIP passes all throughout the game, which obviously there's still decks like Charizard also do, but this it kind of feeds in really, really well to how chien-pao naturally likes to work. It also gets Prime Catcher, which is again, it can create some really explosive turns, but it also just saves you space on previous chien-pao lists, which means you get to play a little bit more consistency here and there as well. It's basically, the deck feels like it's still pretty much like a sequencing puzzle. There's been a lot of conversation lately about sort of where it falls and what matchups are particularly difficult and stuff like that. And it feels like in a lot of matchups, they go pretty similarly. It's just a lot of times working out exactly what you need for the situation that's staring you down, and then working out how to best navigate your hand to try and maximize your odds. And that's a really good position to be in, because it means that you're playing a deck that doesn't necessarily have too scary matchups. There's a couple of things that you pretty much just scoop to. Things like Snorlax are just pretty woeful, both from early testing that we've done, but also just the data kind of implies that it's pretty much an early lunch in those kind of matchups. But equally, everything else, like a lot of other matchups, are just, can you proficiently find your way to executing the best turn possible? And if you're able to do that, it's a really nice deck to play.
Moving on to Lugia then, this one has done really well in our first week of online tournaments, and not taking too much of that into account, but also just thinking of it more objectively. We do think Lugia is really good, and I actually think for the EUIC it's better positioned than Charizard, so we are going to put it as our highest tier deck. Bit of a hot take alert, but we're not doing it just to be edgy. I actually think Lugia's matchups into the other A-tier stuff is good. Like, you're very good into Snorlax, which is a big boast, I would say. You're like close to favored into Charizard and Chen, which is good. And really, you're only trying to dodge like Iron Hands as the new big bad matchup. That is basically a concession for you. You don't particularly love Lost Box either, that also plays Iron Hands, but at least you have some hand disruption at your disposal, and you can play double Snorlax to give yourself a chunky one prize Pokemon that's awkward to deal with. So Lugia's by no means the most consistent deck in the room, but its metagame positioning is incredible right now. The sort of unknown quantity is how popular is this Future Hands deck going to be, and we'll discuss that a little bit later on, but it's a bit of a question mark, a bit of an unknown right now, because its matchup spread's kind of weird. But I think in terms of like beating the other A-tier, most likely most popular decks in the room, Lugia is really good at that, and it's also good at dealing with like a couple of the counter decks as well. Both of the Arc Tina and Lost Tina are like pretty tough matchups against Lugia. So yeah, you're pretty well positioned against basically all of the top tier stuff, which really means it's going to be well positioned when the matchup you're trying to dodge is actually like low enough play rates, most likely, that you'll be able to do it a decent amount of the time.
The final deck that we feel is tier 1 is actually Snorlax. Snorlax has a really good matchup into two of these A-tier decks, which I think is going to be really important. We've seen over the Paradox Rift format that it's very positive into Charizard. Mimikyu is a really difficult Pokemon for them to deal with. And similarly with chien-pao Baxcalibur, they just can't get over the amount of disruption that Snorlax actually like gives them. Lugia, I think, is a bit contentious, and that's going to be the one that you have to kind of dodge and weave of these three. But equally, your matchups into some of the other things are also just so good. Even things that have previously been a little bit more difficult, like Giratina, now are much better now that they don't have paths. So you're able to play things like Sinnoh to block their jet energies and stuff like that. There's lots of little nuances here and there that have meant that even some of Snorlax's rougher matchups have got a lot better over sort of the release of Temporal Forces and the rotation. I think there's a lot of discourse at the moment about Snorlax and how powerful it is. I think there's a lot of people that really are rating it. So I think it's going to be on people's radar. And I don't think it's going to be sort of a crazy play rate, but I do think it's relevant enough that people will be testing against it, but also will just be sort of default picking it just because of how good its matchup spread is to some of these top decks. So I think you really have to respect it. I think there's definitely ways around it, and there's still decks that it does sometimes struggle with, but there definitely are huge reasons to play it right now. And I think it's another of these decks that seems like a really good points pick, because people that aren't respecting it, it can just pretty much roll over some matchups. And again, if you're expecting things like chien-pao and Charizard to be some of the most popular decks in the room, which I think pretty much everyone is, at least with Charizard, but probably with chien-pao as well, you're going to be in a really good position. Like I say, Lugia feels contentious, but it's definitely winnable. It only has it slightly unfavored in early data, so it's not like a complete whitewash. It's still a winnable matchup for Snorlax. So yeah, really well positioned. Again, it never feels like one of these decks that's going to climb above a particularly high play rate just because people sort of have this sort of predisposition to not want to play it themselves. But it is still another A-tier deck, and one that you really do have to at least have a game plan against, or know that you're basically sacking the matchup in some deck's case like chien-pao. You have to at least know, like, if you're trying to win the matchup or trying to play the matchup, what your lines are, because I think it is going to be a popular one in the room.
Moving on to our B-tier decks then, I'm going to start with Losone Giratina, slightly falling from grace from the previous format, but still, we believe, a pretty high-tier contender, where it really struggles from the top-tier stuff into Lugia and chien-pao, but it's got a really good Charizard and a pretty good Snorlax, so you've got like two good and two kind of bad matchups, so kind of balances out in that case. And you're pretty 50-50-ish against the other like mid to lower tier stuff. We know that Tina is relatively consistent and has a good amount of comeback potential. Even without Path of the Peak, you still have that Roxanne hand disruption, which is still super relevant, especially when you can have countercatcher plays or Sableye plays that can also get rid of opposing engine Pokemon. Crucially, barrel that 120 hit points, you can still target down in a number of other matchups. So yeah, I think Tina is actually still just fine, and it's going to continue to be one of the higher tier decks in the game, certainly, and people already have a lot of experience with the Lost Zone engine, and there could be a number of people who would prefer to have the matchup spread of Tina rather than Lost Box, so I still feel like it could be relatively popular, honestly, and I think it's pretty nicely positioned. I could see this one making a grasp to A tier as well as Lost Box, like whichever one comes out on top between the two Lost engines, I think have the best chance of jumping into A tier to join these other decks as kind of like our big top five, but I can't really put my finger on whether it's going to be Lost Tina or Lost Zone Box, which ends up coming out best between the two of them. But yeah, I think people are very experienced with Tina, and they know what to do with the deck at this point, and it's not had a huge drop-off from losing Path.
Onto Arceus Giratina, another deck that obviously had lost path, but has had a bit of a resurgence with post rotation. There's a couple of new tools it can play, as well as just still having a sort of judge based disruption package. It doesn't have that path to peak as well, but you're able to do things pretty consistently with with Starbirth, finding your judges and just trying to at least represent some kind of board turn after turn after turn. Whilst it's not necessarily the craziest board or the most strong thing you can do, it's just actually doing what it's trying to do quite consistently, whilst also trying to disrupt the opponent and stop what they're trying to do. So nothing really new with Arceus Giratina in terms of its game plan. Losing path means it has to be a little bit more aggressive. Things like Iron Leaves and Maximum Belt do mean that you can hit some key breakpoints here and there, and you have a little bit more going into some other matchups where naturally you would have lent on that path to peak disruption. But that's no bad thing, because I think it's you're being a bit less reactive and a bit more proactive and trying to actually close out the game rather than just really relying on this disruption package. You can use that in the early game to establish a decent board and then try and close out the game quite quickly, whether it's through things like Iron Leaves or just having Tina's trying to Lost impact a couple of things for a couple of turns and win the game outright. I think it's still got a couple of issues here and there, and I'm a little bit worried. I think it's a deck that I'm really looking at towards EUIC. I'm a little bit worried about some of the matchups. Lugia looks a little bit shaky, but having a pretty positive Charizard, a playable Snorlax is always a matchup that I like to at least have a good time into. So it feels like one of these decks where it's a bit of like matchup roulette. There's a couple of things you really don't want to see, but a couple of things that theoretically, if everything goes relatively smoothly for you, it should be pretty favorable for you. Things like the future hands always seems to struggle with it and things like that as well. So yeah, there's nothing crazy like flashy with Arctina. It just looks like one of these consistent decks that tries to hit a few good matchups, dodge a few bad matchups, and just weave its way into the game with judges and things like that. It's, like I say, lost the disruption package, but I think it's actually been quite beneficial because it can just try and close out games a little bit more aggressively now. So yeah, it's not going to be in that A tier, but I still think it's a pretty good pick, just for a pretty like safe comfort pick for people. One that I'm really looking towards is just being able to, cheese my way through games with Judge and trying to close out the game with a powerful attacker in Giratina or Iron Leaves.
I may as well touch on the other Lost Zone engine, seeing as I touched on it a little bit when talking about Tina. Compared to the Lost Tina, I think Lost Zone Box has a better time into the Lugia than the Giratina does. But I think it has a slightly worse time to Zard. Like, Tina is happy to see Zard, whereas Lost Box is a little bit less comfortable. So that's kind of the trade-off. You're having a much better time to the Lugia to have a slightly worse Zard, and vice versa for the Tina. I think a lot of your other matchups are quite familiar and similar to the Tina. You have a slightly better chien-pao, I would expect, as well. But again, we know the engine at this point. We know it could be consistent. You can throw in tech Pokemon. We've seen things like Hooper EX. Mew EX is a really interesting one for me as well. That can help out Charizard whilst also helping both Tina matchups. The Arctina as well isn't one you always love to see. So Mew EX feels quite versatile and powerful to me. Those would be Pokemon that I'm considering in the Lost Zone box. The cool thing is that Lost Box got super wonky and weird in the previous format, and it looks like you can play a slightly more streamlined version and be competitive in the new format. So at least your list looks a lot cleaner and isn't quite as chaotic. So that is something good going for Lost Box. Like I said with the Lost Tina, I think it could make an argument for itself to go into that A tier, depending on where the percentages of the decks lie and what tech Pokemon you can squeeze into your list without compromising your consistency too much. So yeah, I think it's overall a pretty solid choice and still a powerful archetype.
Onto Future Hands, a deck that we've kind of talked about a little bit already when I touched on the Future Box list. The Future Hands deck, I think, was one of the most popular decks in the first couple of days of this set being released on live. I feel like I saw lots of people making videos about it, and it was one of the most popular decks in some of the early tournaments, and obviously it had a big splash in some of the tournaments in Japan as well. So I feel like this archetype has actually been explored more than a lot of the other new archetypes. So I feel like there's not sort of massive room for movement of where the archetype's going to go. I think the archetype is really cool, to be honest. It really tries to do a couple of really cool things. It tries to force a really awkward one prize, a really powerful one that if you ignore, basically it will carry on steamrolling, but if you don't ignore it and you end up taking it out, you open up the world of like counter catchers and gift energies and all this stuff that then like Iron Hands just tries to basically roll you over with amp you very much and stuff like that. So it's a really cool concept. I think it's a little bit too linear for some of the decks out there. It really likes to face some of these like multi-prize Pokemon that are weak to lightning or these low HP basics, and starts to struggle with things like Giratina, Arceus, because they're big HP basics that you can't one-shot through weakness. And if you can't really capitalize on trying to get that 1v knockout in the first instance, they then eventually have way too much HP and are able to sort of out-trade you. So it has like quite a specific matchup thread that it wants to try and hit, but it's got some pretty powerful matchups within that. Also really struggle with Snorlax because they're basically a little bit too big for you in the early game, and then you aren't able to move your crowns out of the way and things like that when it gets to the mid to late game, and all of a sudden there's just no real answer for that. So that's another thing that's sort of contentious for me. I think it struggles with some of these mid-tier matchups. I think it's one of those decks which we will definitely see some make it through to day two. You hit 2 or 3 Charizards and 2 or 3 chien-paos and like an amount of like 6 or 7 of the top 3 out of the 4 decks that we've talked about today, and you're going to be in a really good position. But if you start hitting some of those other matchups, that's where things can get a little bit awkward for you. I think the deck's really cool though. I feel like there's not too much movement for where the deck is going to go in terms of I feel like it's kind of been figured out. But if you're able to dodge and weave Snorlaxes, it feels quite impressive. I think there's a couple of other awkward matchups here and there that's like sort of in the lower tiers, but in general, if you can try and capitalize on feasting on like low HP basics and things like the Lugias that are basically have no real answer to you, they just can't keep up because you're rating them so well, you're going to have a pretty good day. I can't think there's too many answers that they can even put in to try and make the matchup too much better either. So there's nothing really they can do. So it's this kind of matchup roulette thing again, where you're really trying to dodge a couple of key matchups in the top tiers, but you really feast on some of the other ones as well. So it feels like because it's a little bit more feast or famine with that matchup roulette, it's a little bit more awkward to rely on. But again, I think it's a really cool deck, and I can definitely see some people piloting it and playing it that have just been playing it over the past week or so, because I think it's a really fun deck to play as well. It does something a little bit different that decks haven't really done in the past, and equally like people just love to hate Iron Hands, so people will just like sort of flock to it anyway as well. So it's a nice way of it's like a new way of playing Iron Hands, like how Miraidon sort of found a way of playing Iron Hands and bullying people with it in certain situations. This deck just basically does that like on steroids, and it just tries to really push people out of the game. So fun deck. Don't think it can really be raised too much higher than B tier just because of some of the awkward matchups in that B and A tier, but really likes to farm Lugias. And if you think Lugia is going to be a popular matchup, you could have a really good day, to be honest.
Let's round out the B tier with Arc Vulpix. It obviously got a pretty high-profile Champions League second place placement. It doesn't really have that same online popularity and presence right now, but I do think it's quite interesting. Comparing it directly to Arctina, where obviously you are going to share a number of similar matchups, you're basically trading a good chien-pao matchup with the Vulpix coming into the list for having a slightly worse matchup into like Arctina and Lostina, which is kind of interesting, honestly, because if the Arctina is like good into 2 of the top decks and bad into 2 of the top decks, the Vulpix is good into 3 of the 4, and then you're just worried about Lugia, really, which is kind of interesting. I think if you're really trying to narrow down the format to just beating the very best decks, Vulpix is an interesting consideration. You also lose a bit of percentage into future hands, so you are quite narrow with your matchup spread with the Vulpix, but it's certainly still a card worth being aware of, because we know that these frustrating walling attacks can be quite relevant and can go deep in tournaments. Even just EUIC last year is an example of that. So I think it's an archetype worth respecting, and has a pretty interesting matchup spread, actually, being very good into a lot of the A-tier stuff.
Onto that C tier then, and we're going to start with Roaring Moon, a deck that was massively popular towards the end of the Paradox Rift format. It was the most popular deck at the past couple of major events. So a deck that I still think needs to be respected and needs to be kept in mind. Obviously, the engine took a bit of a hit here and there with things like VIP Pass going, but still a pretty reliable engine and like a pretty reliable shell, and also gained some new things in like the new Roaring Moon as well, the baby Roaring Moon, to give you another potential one prize avenue. A deck that I think people will, again, naturally flock to a little bit just because it's one that people will be comfortable with. It's one that has seen massive popularity over the past few weeks and loses some of the matchups that it struggled with, lose some percentage points just from the rotation and stuff as well. So I think there's definitely a lot more issues with it. Obviously, things like the engine being hurt by losing VIP Pass and stuff like that. I think there's other racing decks like chien-pao that do it a little bit better, but it's pretty low to the ground. It does what it tries to do quite consistently. We've seen that these kinds of decks typically find a way, even if they're not the most powerful or the most popular, they're still pretty reliable and pretty consistent. So just given based on how like popular it's been over the past few weeks of tournaments and towards the end of this past meta, I still expect people to kind of stick with it and just adapt their deck slightly and try and sort of keep up with the meta, even though it may not be the best call. Having a reliable engine and that kind of stuff is just in these early tournaments sometimes just as good as playing the best deck in the objectively in the room, because you're just trying to do what you're trying to do much more consistently. So still respect it. I think it has a couple of awkward sort of matchups here and there and struggles with some of these other racing decks, but equally it's been reliable over the past month or so and has proved to be really popular. So I think people will still stick with it enough to warrant it being a tiered deck in the list.
Onto a Snorlax Pidgeot. Unlike some of the D-tier stuff where we've basically offered easy upgrades to some of them, there's actually some worlds where you want to play the Pidgeot build over regular Snorlax. You're having a really good time into the Snorlax mirror match by playing the Pidgeot engine, which is kind of cool. You're just cherry picking the stuff that's good in the matchup faster than they can, and because you can much more proactively attack, you're not just sat there using Rotom, which also sort of cycles them towards the bottom of the deck a little bit more often. So gaining a good, effective mirror match, very, very favoured mirror match actually, is low-key pretty interesting. But you are sacrificing a little bit into the matchups that do have that one-hit KO potential. Things like chien-pao, even though the matchup is still free for Snorlax, it can give them that avenue of a couple prizes where things can maybe get shaky. The Arctina's already tough, but Lostina gets much more difficult because they have that one-hit KO potential. You're worried about giving your opponent too many easy prizes, and obviously the Pidgeot engine was better as this sort of toolbox approach that could cherry pick the right things in all these sorts of random crazy scenarios. But because we lose Peonia, playing all these one-ofs sometimes just don't come together because you can't access them anymore. So I think inherently the deck got worse to rotation, and I think you're giving too many outs to different decks right now compared to just a pure lax, personally.
Onto Espathra, I think a deck that no one would have really expected us to be talking about until the past couple of days worth of tournaments or a couple of weekends worth of tournaments, where it's had a bit of a surge of results over in Japan in the city leagues, and because of that has seen a bit more play online as well. This archetype is really interesting. It's kind of a combination. We've only got Espathra on here, but also typically plays Burnett as well. And I think it's actually the Burnett is one of the key pieces as to why this is actually making it onto this C tier, because there's a couple of key rare candy decks right now that basically you can pretty much lock out of the game. Chien-pao doesn't play any Arctobac, so that's usually pretty much locked up anyway. But even Charizard, because we're moving more towards a sort of Pidgeot variant of Charizard, I think that's been far more popular over the past week or so of tournaments, and we're kind of seeing this position where Pidgeot is out favoring Bibarel again. People are moving away from these Evo lists where they're playing double Charmeleon and stuff like that. So you can try and cheese your way through Charizard as well as having Snorlax potentially be, they're not able to use their really powerful item cards like Countercatcher and stuff. So yeah, looking at the top three decks, the only one you're super worried about is Lugia, and even then you can try and stop them from playing certain cards like Ultra Ball and stuff, which set up their combo turns. Now, admittedly, if Lugia gets into the game, it gets pretty scary because basically none of the rest of your deck really does anything, because by then they're tutoring everything out of their deck and they aren't worried about Espathra's ability or anything like that. So if they get into the game, it's pretty much a lost cause, but there will be situations where an early Burnett can put them behind enough that maybe you're able to make it through. So yeah, it's an interesting one. It feels like it has pretty shaky for the rest of the B tier downwards, because it's trying to do some very specific things, but it does those specific things quite well against Charizard, chien-pao, and Snorlax, and I think that's why it's had a bit of a sort of an uptick in play over in some of the Japan City leagues. It could be a fun one to try out. I don't think it's ever one that I would feel massively comfortable in sort of investing some time into or recommending, but it has at least boasted some pretty interesting and positive win rates against some of the A-tier decks, which means it has to be at least above that D tier, where there's, like we say, these decks that just don't have good enough matchups.
Yeah, and we'll close things out with Gardevoir. Again, a fall from grace. I think most people expected this with the amount of cards that we lost to rotation, but it is hanging on in there as a relevant contender. Actually kind of interesting that it's one of the only decks that boasts a good time into Lugia and Charizard. I'm surprised by it having a good Charizard. I thought on paper it would be much worse than it actually is, because I expected that Charizard can piece together the Vacuum plus KO EX combinations too easily to undo a lot of your pressure that the Gardevoir can churn out. But you can still have the great comeback package that Gardevoir is kind of known for, with counter catches on your own end and lots of Iono. And with Drifloon, with Screamtail, you do have great options getting through high hit point Pokemon like Charizard. You can obviously remove Archeops from the board pretty quickly against Lugia. You can deal with Baxcalibur very, very quickly. Snorlax is a iffy one, but if you play Churro Palpad like Guardy did in the past, you could have a decent time there as well. And we know that this can be a decent Iono comeback deck, and still has at the forefront many single prize Pokemon. I think the biggest sort of question mark and headache is just how many vacuums are going to be in the Lost Box decks, the Lost Tinas, the Arc Tinas. Even Future Hands has justification to play the Lost Vacuum, and that's when decks can take not just like a 2-prize turn against you, but like sometimes a 3-prize turn, which is really, really bad for the Guardy list. But it's been pretty intriguing to me, actually, how much better this has performed than I expected. Having an Arvin engine, having just 4 Refinement Curlier does mean you still cycle through the deck pretty nicely, and you are still trying to put your opponent in that position of having lots of 1-prizes thrown at their face over and over again, and constantly slamming that hand disruption, having the option for Collapse Stadium. There's still all those same good elements of Gardevoir that was in the past, but you're just a little bit shakier now as to what outs your opponent has in the deck to really turn the tide. So, interesting deck, and I think it's actually one to keep an eye out for, because it could once again be climbing a little bit, depending on sort of counts of vacuums and if people even care about the Gardevoir matchup at all. So, yeah, it's a pretty interesting one to end things out on. It's actually a bit of a positive note for Gardevoir players who may still have a chance to continue playing this archetype.
So yeah, that's our tier list. I think I think it's like kind of similar to what a lot of people are kind of thinking, or where a lot of people expected the format to land. Though equally, it like Lugia, I think, has impressed almost everybody. It obviously did really well in the Champions League, but it's actually continued to not just be a one-hit wonder and actually be a really relevant meta threat. So yeah, it's going to be really interesting to see how these decks perform. I think EUIC is always one of the most exciting tournaments of the year, basically because it's rotation on top of a new set. New sets are always exciting, but when there's a rotation as well, it's always really cool to see how everything sort of plays out. So yeah, really interesting stuff. Hopefully we will have some good times at EUIC and we'll be able to see where things fall and how things land up. So yeah, thank you very much for watching. I've been Jack with Joe from OmniPoke, and we look forward to seeing you guys in another video tomorrow. Cheers.